In the previous lectures, I've gone through the basic mechanisms for mind, that is, image schemas, prototypes, metaphors, frames, blends, and so on. I'll review some of that today. And I just completed a lecture on poetry and poetic metaphor. And what I'd like to do today is point out the implications of cognitive linguistics for philosophy. Let me begin. How many of you have attended the previous lectures, or some of the previous lectures? Oh, wow. Lots? Okay. So I won't have to say that much to begin with, but I'll say some things. This study of philosophy began with my own work and the work of Mark Johnson, who is a philosopher, on conceptual metaphor. What we discovered together was that conceptual metaphor is not in the words, it's in the way you think. It's in the way you understand one kind of thing in terms of another kind of thing. For example, when we understand time, we understand time around the world in terms of motion. So you have, and location in terms of space. So for example, in English, the future is understood as ahead, the past is behind. There are some languages in the world where the past is ahead and the future is behind. Very, very different way of understanding time. And in addition to that, we have two general metaphors in motion. There's one in which each time is a moving object that can move towards you, so that the time for action may come, the time can be here, the time can be past. You can have one time following another. This is the preceding time, the following time, and as they come towards you, you can speak of the following day or the preceding day. So each of these, as they go, each moving object, each entity, can be seen as a time relative to you, or you can be seen as moving over a time landscape, where you do things on time, within a certain amount of time, so that either Christmas can come up on you, or you can come up on Christmas. Now, that is just one of hundreds, maybe thousands, of metaphors in terms of which you think every day. They're also the way you reason. They're very, very, very complex metaphor systems. Some of them, there's a set of primitive metaphors that I've talked about that you learn simply by functioning in the world. For example, affection is warmth. Okay? Why? Because when you're held as a child, the affection you feel from your parent corresponds to the warmth of being held. There are two parts of your brain that are active, the emotional part and the part that registers temperature. They're in different parts of the brain, and when they're active together over and over, they form connections, and those neural connections constitute the metaphor. They allow you to understand the emotional part, the emotion of affection in terms of warmth. So you say then, the language follows, that he's a warm person, a cold person, and so on. So these metaphors occur all over. They are normal. They're there by the thousand. There are thousands of them. You probably learn hundreds by the time you are 6 or 7 years old. And the conceptual metaphors precede the linguistic expression of them. And it's important to understand that the metaphors are not in the language. They're not in the words. They're in your mind. They're in the way you reason. Now, why does this matter for philosophy? Let us begin, and we'll come back to it, begin with Anglo-American philosophy. In Anglo-American philosophy, there's an assumption that truth is the basis of meaning. Meaning is based on truth, and that truth is a relationship between words and the world. Now, let us consider another common metaphor for time. There's a metaphor that time is a resource, like money, so that you can waste time, spend time, invest your time, budget your time. You go around thanking people for their valuable time. You can measure how much time you use to do something, and so on. So as if it were some sort of resource, like money. So this time as money metaphor is very common both in China and in America. It's not true in all cultures. Some cultures do not consider time a resource. People just live their lives. They don't worry about measuring it out in terms of amounts. But in other parts of the world, we think of time in terms of resources and possibly money. Now, can a metaphor be true? And the answer is yes. For example, it is possible for someone to waste an hour of your time. Suppose you have to do something, you have a busy day, someone comes in and they start to talk to you, and they talk to you, and they talk to you, and you just say, "Oh, you're wasting my time." That, if you understand time as a resource and as money, if that's the way you live your life, then it is possible for someone to waste a certain amount of your time. But objectively, outside of your understanding, in the universe in general, time is not a resource. If you think just about the universe before people existed, time was not a resource for doing anything because there was no one to do anything, right? Time existed, but it was just time, right? Or maybe time didn't exist, and that's an interesting question, and we'll get to that. Did time exist before there were people to understand time? Right? Now, physicists assume that it does. And we'll talk about that too. So there are a number of fairly deep questions that we'll be getting at. But in terms of wasting time, certainly before there were people, there was no wasting time, spending time, no time as a resource. So time as a resource, wasting time is a metaphor that only requires your understanding. It's not outside of you. So the theory of truth that says the truth is in the relationship between the words and the external world, that is a false theory of truth. It's called the correspondence theory of truth, and it is false. It cannot handle metaphorical truths. Truths that are true by virtue of you're living your life through some metaphor. Okay? Because you're living a life you have to go through time being chopped up as resources. That's what students do. Now, that is profound for a number of reasons. If the correspondence theory of truth is false, then Anglo-American philosophy all goes out the window, because that is the central principle behind all of it. It all depends on a correspondence theory of truth. If there's no correspondence theory of truth, there is no theory of meaning that's based on truth. Therefore, there's no account of meaningfulness in any part of philosophy, and that philosophy can't work. Now, this is also true of the version of Anglo-American philosophy that uses logic. There's a version called formal philosophy, in which a language is understood as a system of symbols, just meaningless formal symbols, as you would have in a formal logic. And then these symbols are mapped onto some understanding, some model of the world, usually a set theoretical model. And in order to do that, there is more philosophy needed. That is, you need to understand the world as being made up of entities, like you're an entity, the microphone is an entity, the book is an entity, and so on. Entities with properties and relations out there in the world at any time. Then the idea is to model that in set theory with set theoretical entities, abstract entities standing for you and the book and the chair and the table for the entities, and then sets. A property is the set of things that has that property. So for example, the blue chairs. There's a set of blue things assumed in the world out there, and so on. Now, we saw in lecture 2 that there is no such thing as the set of blue things in the world because color is computed by the human body and brain. There is no color in the world itself. We know that color arises because objects reflect wavelengths, but wavelengths are not color. Wavelengths are combined by the eye through the color cones and neural circuitry, and the eye and the brain produce color given wavelengths that are reflected. So there's no color in the world, and a sentence like "the chair is blue," well, cannot be true on the basis of the relationship between symbols in the world because there is nothing blue in the world in itself, outside of us. Now, so the correspondence theory of truth, which says things are true independent of people, that theory can't work for color. It can't work for metaphor. It can't work for many, many other cases that we have found. And that's important. It doesn't work for frame semantics. There are no prototypes. When we talked about prototype semantics, there are no prototypes outside of human beings. Why? If you think about the types of prototypes that there are typical case prototypes. For example, take the category husband. There are typical husbands, ideal husbands. There is a category of nightmare, horrible husbands. Okay? Now, we understand these prototypes in terms of forms of reasoning. If you have a typical case, it's what you can normally expect. If you have an ideal case, then you use it to measure as a standard to measure other people. If you have a nightmare case, you use it as a standard for something to be avoided. Okay? We do this with any category. You can have a typical used car, an ideal used car, and a nightmare used car. Right? Any category at all. But those categories are not out in the world independent of us. So we construct a conceptual system. Conceptual systems arise, systems of concepts, meaningful systems, arise by our interactions with the world and our interactions with each other. They're not just out in the world independent of us. Okay? What that says is that Anglo-American philosophy doesn't work. If a metaphorical sentence can be true, then Anglo-American philosophy doesn't work. It's a major, major point. Now, I'll tell you a true story. When I first met the philosopher Mark Johnson, we started talking about metaphor. He happened to come through Berkeley to teach for a while. We went out for a cup of coffee, and he had worked on metaphor in philosophy. I had been looking at examples in linguistics, and we had come to similar conclusions about metaphors being mappings from one domain to another, and really being in the mind and so on, and not just being in words. Now, we then asked, could we write a philosophical paper about this? There had just been, at the time, 2 major papers written in America by 2 of the great major philosophers there, Donald Davidson and John Searle, who were both at my university. And we asked, could we write a paper saying that criticizing their work? And we thought about this for a while, and we came back and we said, no, we both agreed we could not write such a paper. Why? Because what we were claiming contradicted the presupposition of all of their philosophy. all of their philosophy assumed the correspondence theory of truth. And we were denying what they presupposed. And you can't just write a paper in a journal denying a presupposition. You can argue within the presuppositions, but you can't just say to the journal, everything the journal is based on is false. Right? You just can't do that. So what we did was write a book instead, Metaphors We Live By, saying just that about philosophy. Now, it turns out, oh, thank you very much. I'm getting a little dry as I talk. So at this point, I said to Mark Johnson, is there any philosophy in the West that fits what we have discovered? And he said, well, maybe a little bit. There were two philosophers, Merleau-Ponty and Dewey, John Dewey, and he said, well, they say some of these things, but they're not very clear. They're kind of vague. You can't get very far with them, but they do accept, they do understand some of these things. But virtually all other philosophy in the history of Western philosophy goes against this. I didn't believe him. I said, do you mean that since the time of the Greeks, 2,500 years ago, there's no well-known philosopher who has said this besides Dewey and Merleau-Ponty, who are in the 20th century? He said, he's an expert in the history of philosophy. He said, no, that's it. So I said to him, well, you're a philosopher. Make up a philosophy. Is that better? Is that going to work better? Okay. He said, you're a philosopher. Make up a philosophy. And he laughed. And he said, philosophers don't make up philosophies. They only comment on other people's philosophies. Now, is that better? Yeah, okay. Yay. Now, since then, we took up the challenge. We wrote a book called Philosophy in the Flesh. And when we sat down to write this book, we started in 1991 and finished it in 1998. So it took 7 years. It's a big book. When we sat down and to write this book, we made a list of everything that needed to be said. And he said, Mark looked at this list and he said, that's impossible. No one can write this book. But after only 7 years, it's a big book. And there's a reason. Because you have to go through it in a lot of ways. The first thing you have to do, if you ask this question, what is the implication of cognitive linguistics for philosophy, is that you have to ask, what is a philosophy? Moreover, if you are saying that existing philosophies don't work, you have to provide a new one. Well, what does it mean to provide a new philosophy? I mean, we're just two people. We sit down and we say, well, you know, there are all these really smart philosophers who have written for those 2,500 years. It's a little daunting to make one up. What did they have to do to make up a philosophy? So we sat down and analyzed the structure of philosophies. I mean, linguists can do things like this. We analyze, you know, discourse. So we said, what is a philosophy? What do you have to do? Well, the first thing you have to do is have a method of analysis. Every major philosopher has some sort of philosophical method. And we had a method, cognitive linguistics. It is a method of analysis. So I said, okay, that's the easy part. We've done the method. Now, what about the rest? What else do you have to do to construct a philosophy? Well, you have to give an answer to the question, questions like, what is truth? What is meaning? Okay? So what we suggested, we looked at these cases like, he wasted an hour of my time this morning, a metaphorical truth. And we said, what makes that true? We said it wouldn't be true for someone who didn't have this metaphor. But if you have the metaphor and you understand the world in terms of that metaphor, then truth can be based on that understanding. That if you understand your life and you understand the world in so that you believe that time is a resource, if you act as if time were a resource and a money-like resource, then something like, he wasted an hour of my time, can be true. So what we said was that the theory of truth requires that truth be based on understanding. And then we needed a theory of understanding. Now, that comes out of work being done on neuroscience and language, which I talked about in Lecture 5. By the way, for those of you who are interested, there will be copies of all these lectures made available. Professor Lee, of course, will have copies of everything made. There's videotaping these. So if you missed it, it's there. And if you want the overheads from Lecture 5, you can email him and he'll send you a bunch of overheads. These are the PowerPoints. The idea there is that meaning is based on mental simulation, through neural simulation. It's a theory of simulation semantics, and it says that given a result in neuroscience that shows that when you do something, either make a movement or you perceive something, the same part of the brain is active as when you imagine doing the movement or seeing something, and when you understand a sentence or a word that expresses that concept. Now, these results from neuroscience are very profound, because they say, consider the following example. Suppose I have the example, John took a drink of water. Okay? Now, unless you can at least imagine what it is to take a drink of water, you can't understand the sentence. If you can understand the sentence, then you can at least imagine what it is to do it. Now, you can imagine things that can't exist. You can imagine pigs that fly. You can imagine all kinds of non-existent things by putting concepts together. And that's something that you can do with your brain. So we have a theory of how you can imagine non-existent things because you have concepts in your brain that you can put together and then activate those parts of the brain. So the idea is that simulation semantics gives you a theory of meaning not only for existing things, but for imagined things. And that's what a theory of meaning requires. So what we've done is say, look, the theory of meaning is based on understanding, which is based on neural simulation, and the theory of truth is based on understanding. So if you understand something via a metaphor, the metaphor can be true. Now, how does this fit the world? How is it possible for a theory of meaning based on neural understanding to be able to say something true or false about something in the world like lifting up a bottle? Well, the way that works is again given by neuroscience. As I mentioned in Lecture 5, there are things called canonical neurons. These are neurons that fire when you either perform an action or you see something you can perform it on. These neurons connect you to things in the world that you act on. That is, there's a biological mechanism that connects you to things that you act on. And similarly, when you perceive something, there are mirror neurons. If you see someone else doing something, those neurons fire, the same neurons are firing when you do the same thing that someone else is doing. That connects you to them. So we have in our brains and in our bodies mechanisms, neural mechanisms, that connect us to the world and to other people. And it is that allows our concepts to fit the world and to fit what other people are doing. and to have the same concepts across people. Okay? Very important that you can get a neural explanation, a scientific explanation for something as deep as that. Now, so the first part of this book is an account of the theory of truth, meaning and understanding and situation semantics in terms of a neural theory of mind and language. Then metaphor fits perfectly into that because you can understand things via metaphors. Now, a further thing that we needed to do was ask, how do we understand scientific truth? For example, how do we get evidence for a theory of metaphor? And that comes from what we call convergent evidence. There are 10 different sources of evidence for a theory of metaphor, and they come from different areas. So one might say, look, if you had only one source of evidence, doesn't prove anything. If it's one source of evidence, how do you know that you're not just making it up with the theory? However, if you have 10 independent sources of evidence and they converge, then you know you're on the right track. So the evidence, in part, comes from the study of polysemy, how corresponding words in a source domain map onto a target domain. For example, in the case of time as a resource, we have words like waste, spend, budget, invest, and so on, which are words for money, and then they map consistently onto time, so that we know that there's evidence from the words. When you reason about take the inferences about money and resources, then those inferences also map onto time for reasoning about time. And so we get a second source of evidence, which is evidence from inference. There's a third source of evidence from novel metaphor, like poetry and poetic metaphor. And this morning, at another university, I gave a lecture going through all the evidence from poetic metaphor, that ordinary metaphor works in the way we have. There's a book called More Than Cool Reason by myself and Mark Turner that goes through this in a whole book's worth of examples. Then the fourth source of evidence is historical change, and Eve Sweetser has written a book on how the same metaphors apply from Indo-European all the way up to the present, and how they govern the change of meaning in words. So if you have something like a metaphor like knowing is seeing, whenever a new word for seeing comes into existence in a very short time, 50 or 100 years, that word comes to mean knowing. So over and over and over again, and you have evidence for metaphor from historical change. There's evidence from sign language. There's evidence from gesture. There's evidence from language learning. There's evidence from discourse analysis, and so on. So what we outline in this book is the idea that there's converging evidence for this, and that's how you know something in science. In science, you have to have evidence from many different areas that converge before you have an acceptable scientific theory. And that's a very important thing for understanding the nature of scientific knowledge. So at the beginning of this book, the first 7 chapters is about just doing those parts of constructing a philosophy. Then there is a very, very deep part of any philosophy. Every philosopher, if he has a method, must apply the method to the most basic ideas in philosophy. Well, what are the most basic ideas in philosophy? If you have to apply the method to that, what are they? Well, every philosopher has to give an account of time and space. Time, space, and causes, events, what else? Ideas, an understanding of the mind, an understanding of the self. Who are you? What does it mean to have a self? An understanding of morality. Okay? And finally, an understanding of being. What do we do? What is it to exist? Okay? So all of these must be addressed by anybody pretending to be a philosopher. So we made a list of all of these concepts, and we said, okay, we're cognitive linguists, let's go and do an analysis of these concepts. Well, it turns out with space, the major way of understanding space is through image schemas, which we discussed in Lecture 2. That is, things like source paths and goals and containers and rotations and things of this sort, contact. That had already been done in cognitive linguistics. But what about time, events, causation, morality, and so on? Well, it turns out that they're all metaphorical for the most part. That we have metaphors not only for time, but there's a whole series of metaphors for events and for causes. And so, for example, in Lecture 6, I went over the metaphors for events and causes in great detail, and in this book there's a whole chapter on that. The basic metaphors is that a state is a rebounded region in space. Changes are movements into or out of that region. Causes are forces. Purposes are destinations, and so on. And those metaphors are universal. They occur around the world. And then there are other metaphors like that that are variations on those, and we discuss them at very great length. When we're done discussing them, we notice something amazing. If you look at causation, the usual account of causation in every philosophy is that there is one thing, causation. But what we find is that there are many types of causation, each coming about via a different combination of frames and metaphors. And therefore, causation is not just something out there in the world, but something that we understand. For example, take the idea that causes are forces that can move something from one state to another, that's from one place to another. So we look at causal verbs. What is a causal verb? Well, something like bring, carry, throw, push, pull, propel. Anything where you exert force with the result that something moves from one place to another. Each of those verbs works differently. They have different inferences. If I bring something to you, then I'm coming along with it, and I'm exerting force the whole time. If I throw it to you, then I'm only exerting force at the beginning, and it's going to you by itself. If I'm pulling it, the thing I'm pulling is going to where I am. If I'm pushing it, it's moving away from where I am, and so on. Each verb works differently. And then when you apply them to causation, the same differences occur. So, take a sentence like, President Roosevelt brought America out of the Depression. Brought means he was applying causal force the entire time he was president. He was doing things that had results the whole time. Suppose you go to a baseball game and someone hits a home run. You can say, the home run threw everyone into a frenzy. Threw. Okay? That is, first the home run occurs, then you go into a frenzy. It's like first you have force on the ball, then it goes somewhere. You can't say the home run brought everyone into a frenzy. Okay? You don't say it carried everyone into a frenzy. And so on. If you start looking at which verbs you can use in which sentences and with what meanings, It turns out there are lots and lots of different kinds of logics of causation. And this says that causation is not a unitary phenomenon. There are lots of them out there in the world, and in this chapter we discuss at least 22 types. There are a lot, almost 24 types of causation with different logics. That's news to philosophers. It says causation as a single unitary thing is not just out there in the world. That the way we think metaphorically and the forms of force that we understand provide us with an understanding of the world in terms of causes that make sense to us, and lots of kinds of them. Okay? A very different than a philosophy that says there's one kind of cause out there in the world. And what we do is we go through all the different types of causations. Now, there's another very important part of this book that has to do with morality. There's a whole section on the metaphors for morality. And in there we discovered a number of kinds of metaphors. And let me try to give you some sense of this. In America, and maybe in many other parts of the world, the major metaphor for morality is accounting, what we call the moral accounting metaphor. And in fact, I discovered this, I didn't discover this, it was a student who came to me. He was taking my class, and he was in the business school. He was taking metaphor, and he was taking Introduction to Philosophy, and he was taking business accounting. And he said, Professor Lakoff, I'd like to write a paper about morality. I said, fine. He said, what I've discovered is that when I take my philosophy courses and I go to my business accounting courses, all the philosophers talk about is accounting. I said, gee, that's interesting. Tell me more. And he wrote a paper, a very nice paper about this. By the way, when this book was published, I gave a talk at a local bookstore, and he came with his son. It was 8 years afterwards. He had then had a son, and so on. Very sweet. At any rate, he discovered this general metaphor, and it goes like this. There's a metaphor that well-being is wealth. That is, if I do something good for you, then, at least in English, you can say, you do something good, kind for me, you do something good for me. I can say, I owe you one. I'm in your debt. How can I repay you? It's as if you gave me money. So, metaphorically, helping someone, doing something good for them, for their well-being, is like giving them money, metaphorically. And you say, I owe you for that. I need to repay you. Okay? Now, if I do something bad to you, suppose I harm you in some way, then notice in the first case, how do the books get balanced? Well, I then do a favor back for you. I do something kind for you. In the second case, if I harm you, there are at least 3 different ways for the books to get balanced. That is, if I harm you, then I could do something good to make up for it. That's one possibility. That's called restitution. Restitution is the word in English for doing something good to make up for harm you've done. A second way is retribution. You can harm me back. Okay? And a third way uses what is called moral arithmetic. It is revenge. Revenge is your taking something good away from me. Right? It's like a form of arithmetic where giving bad is taking good. Okay? It's that sort of arithmetic accounting. So, in this moral accounting system occurs in cultures around the world. In Christianity, you have the notion of turning the other cheek. How does that work? Well, the idea in idealistic Christianity, real Christians usually don't turn the other cheek, but in the ideal case, if someone does you harm, notice what that means. It's like they owe you, like they've taken something good away from you, and therefore they owe you. So if they do you harm, then if you turn the other cheek and say, that means do me more harm, then they owe you more. And then you have guilt. Guilt is moral debt. It's understanding of debt for harm done. Right? So basically, turning the other cheek works by guilt. In Buddhism, you have the notion of karma. That is, you do good things to people in the world, and in the long run, maybe in the next life, good things will come to you. There will be balance. Okay? The accounts will be balanced. So if you have good karma, that means you've done good things and you can expect good things back. Okay? So this idea of moral accounting is one of the most basic ideas in all morality. It's a metaphorical idea. Now, there are other important metaphors. For example, there's the idea of, let's call it, moral strength. Moral strength is the following. It assumes there's evil out there in the world. In order to stand up to evil, you have to be strong or you will fall. Okay? Now, that says that there can be such a thing as moral strength, and it has an inference, a very important inference. What if you're morally weak? Suppose you're not morally strong. Suppose you can't stand up to evil. Then you're evil waiting to happen. You're going to fall. Fall is becoming evil. As good is up and bad is down. Okay? So what that says is that if you're not morally strong, you're going to be either you are immoral or you will become immoral. Your immorality waiting to happen. Okay? Very important metaphor. There are others that are common. One is the metaphor of moral authority. That is, it is possible for someone to have a physical authority over you, someone like your parents when you're a child. Your parents can tell you what to do, and if you don't want to do it, they'll move you around. They have a physical authority. They're bigger than you are. Now, similarly, you can have the notion of someone having moral authority, someone who is better than you are, who knows what's right and what's wrong, and who can tell you what's right and wrong. And what follows from that is that you should therefore respect their moral authority when they tell you what's right or wrong. There's another important metaphor for morality, what I call the moral order. The idea that morality and power should go together, that the powerful people in the world should be the moral people. And this says if you want to find out about morality, you look at traditional forms of power. So in this moral order, you have God, in the religious case, God above man. Then you have man above nature, above animals. And you have adults above children. And then in the American and Western version, you have Western culture over non-Western culture, America over other countries. Then you have other versions of this in the moral order. Men above women, Christians above non-Christians, straight people above homosexuals, and so on. So very often what you have in terms, or white people above non-white people. This is a metaphor that is well known in Western culture. It's a metaphor of discrimination. It says that that it is right to discriminate against people if you're higher in the moral order. And it's used to justify discrimination. It's a very evil metaphor for morality. There's another that's very important. Morality can be understood as traveling along a path. That is, there's a path of right action. And you're moral if you stay on the path, and immoral if you go off of the path. Or there is an idea of an area of right action, and you're moral if you stay in the area, and immoral if you go out of the area. Okay? So that is another metaphor of moral boundaries. The word for going out of the area in English is to transgress, to go across a boundary. That's what transgress means. Okay? The word for going off of the path is called deviate. So deviant behavior is something that deviates from the path. It's based on that metaphor. Then there is a metaphor of what I'll call moral essence. The idea here is that everybody has a character, some essence that makes them who they are. And you can be of good character or bad character. That is, you can have something in you that is good, be an inherently good person or an inherently bad person. Right? That is the metaphor of moral essence. And then good people will do good things and bad people will do bad things. That's what follows from that. Then there is a metaphor of moral purity. Morality is purity and immorality is disgusting, awful, yucky things. Right? So in that, to be moral is to be pure, and something that is disgusting, you say, that's disgusting behavior, and so on. It's immoral. Okay. Then there's a metaphor of morality as health, in which you think of immorality as a kind of disease that can spread. Now, this is a very important metaphor in the West because it is the basis of things like imprisonment. What do you do with immoral people? You get them away from moral people by putting them in prison so they don't have contact and their immorality can't spread. Okay? So that's one part. It is also the basis for, in some cases, people moving in the West from the cities to the suburbs. They assume that people in the cities, that the children in the cities are bad people, and that if you move to the suburbs, you'll get away from the bad people because you could catch immorality by being close to them. It's a disease that can spread. And this is, again, widely used in America as justifying movements from the city to the suburbs. So on. Okay. Those are some of the major metaphors for morality. And then there are two kinds of family-based metaphors, which give you totally different views of morality. And these are extremely important metaphors in American culture. They may not occur in Chinese culture at all, but they do occur in American culture. And they form the basis for the difference between political liberals and political conservatives and liberal and conservative morality. So let me give you a sense of how that works. There's a general metaphor that the nation is a family in America. So we have founding fathers, for example, of the nation. We send our sons to war. Given this idea of the nation as a family, there are two distinct kinds of families, giving rise to two distinct views of national morality. One of them is what is called a strict father family. In the strict father family, it is assumed that the world is a dangerous place, that it's difficult, that there's always competition, and there will always be winners and losers, and that children are born bad and have to be made good. And the reason you need a strict father is to protect the family in a dangerous world, to support the family in the difficult world, and to make the bad children into good children. How does the strict father make bad children into good children? Punishment. Painful punishment. Usually physically painful punishment. So, and there's a name for this in America. It's called tough love. The idea is that a strict father who loves his children will beat them when they do something bad, and that is good for the children. Okay? How is it good for the children? The theory in this model of the family is that applying physical discipline will make the children get internal mental discipline, so that in the future they will do only the good things and avoid doing the bad things. So that the way they become moral is that there's a strict absolute morality, there are rules to follow, and they will only follow the rules if they are mentally disciplined. And they get that through physical discipline. That's the idea. Now, another part of this idea is, this family model, is that if you are a disciplined person, then you can become prosperous and wealthy and take care of yourself, become a self-reliant person. How? By following your self-interest. And it is moral to follow your self-interest. And I will talk about, let me go into that for a minute. There's another metaphor for morality. It's called the metaphor of the morality of self-interest. Why is it moral to follow your self-interest in this metaphor? The metaphor, what is very wild and interesting about this metaphor, it is based on another metaphor. It is based on Adam Smith's basic metaphor for capitalism. Adam Smith was the guy who invented capitalism. And he had a metaphor called the metaphor of the invisible hand. And it goes like this. If everybody pursues their own profit, if everybody just tries to make as much money as they can, then he says the profit of all will be maximized by the invisible hand. The invisible hand is nature. That is, it is a law of nature that if everybody pursues their own profit, the profit of all will be maximized. That is Adam Smith's metaphor. There's a version of this in American culture and in American family life, that if everyone pursues their own self-interest, the self-interest of all will be maximized. Is that the strict father defends and supports the family and turns bad children into good children by physically disciplining them, punishing them when they do wrong, and therefore making them not only into moral people, but prosperous people. Okay? That's the strict father model. And this plays, tomorrow I'll be talking about this at Beijing University and showing its role in American politics. Now, the other model, what I'll call the progressive model, the one behind progressive politics, is a very different model of the family and of morality. In the family, it assumes that both parents are equally responsible for raising their children. This is called the nurturant parent model of the family. And in that family, the job of a parent is to nurture the children and to teach the children to nurture others, to turn the children into nurturers of other people. Okay? That is the job of a nurturant parent family. And what is nurturance? two things. Empathy, you care about someone else. You feel what they feel. If a baby cries, you have to, if you're a good parent, you learn what those cries mean. Okay? Empathy and responsibility. If you're to be responsible for a child, you have to be responsible first for yourself, but then you have to do a whole lot of things to raise a child. And a responsible parent is a strong parent. Responsibility requires strength and a lot of other things. It's not easy to be responsible. Now, from those values in the nurturing parent family, there are other values that follow, that are part of the family. If you empathize with the child, you'll want to protect the child. If you empathize with the child, you will want the child to be fulfilled in life. You will want the child to be treated fairly, not unfairly. If the child is to be fulfilled in life, the child must be free enough to be able to seek its own fulfillment. If the child, in order to have freedom, there has to be opportunity, economic opportunity, opportunity for fulfillment, for free action. If there is none, there's no freedom. For there to be opportunity, there has to be prosperity. So you have to seek prosperity. For there to be prosperity, you have to work with other people in your community. So community building is a moral part of this family life. It's an important part of a nurturing family. You can't raise a child alone. The moral values of the community are important. You have to work for them. In addition, if you're going to work and build a community, you must cooperate. So cooperation becomes a family value. To cooperate, you have to have trust. So trust is a value. And if there's going to be trust, you have to be honest. So honesty is a value. And if you're going to, and you won't know if people are being honest unless you have open communication. So in a nurturing parent family, you have the idea that you are going to nurture your child and protect your child and allow your child to be fulfilled in life and to be treated fairly and have freedom and so on. And you want these things for other people too. Okay? That is the basis for progressive politics in America. And so you have in America right now a 50-50 split between two totally different moral systems. And tomorrow we'll show how this works in politics. But those are two kinds of family models in the West. Okay? And probably different than in China, but I don't know. Now, I went through this because metaphor plays a crucial role in morality. To understand what morality is at all, you have to use at least some of these metaphors. If you don't use any of these metaphors at all, if you don't think in any of these terms, there's no morality. There is no such concept. The very concept requires things like accounting. I left out uprightness. That is, moral people are upright, and so on. So what we did in going through this metaphor analysis is to give a theory of morality, and that's one of the things that has to be done if you're going to construct a philosophy. So that is just to give you some sense of why it's important to do cognitive linguistics if you're going to understand philosophy. And there's no philosophy out there now that talks about all of these different considerations in morality. And there's no philosophy that says, as this says, that morality is first constituted by metaphor, and second, that the metaphors are not arbitrary. They come about in a universal way. And let me try to give you a sense of how they are not arbitrary. Think about metaphors like moral strength, or well-being is wealth, or moral health. Why should we have metaphors like this? Morality is about well-being, your well-being and the well-being of other people. Morality is about how you affect the well-being of other people as well as your own. That's the subject matter of morality. And if you look at the way children live around the world, the way they grow up, you ask, what is it that affects your well-being? Well, around the world, you're better off if you're strong than if you're weak. You're better off if you're healthy than if you're sick. You're better off if you can stand upright than if you have to crawl around on the ground. You're better off if you are taken care of than if you're not taken care of. If you go through each of these metaphors, then what you find is they all arise from conditions of well-being in the world. But what about the strict father and nurturing parent models? They arise from two very basic facts about what it is to be a human being. We know from the study of mirror neurons in neuroscience, these are the neurons that fire when either you perform an action or you see someone else perform the same one. We know that these same neurons are there in monkeys. That means we evolved for that to have mirror neurons. Why is that important for morality? The mirror neuron system is in what is called the prefrontal cortex, and that is the cortex, the part of the brain that choreographs your complex actions. It puts together complex actions. It is also connected to, has connections from that part of the brain to the emotional system. Now, there is a physiology of emotions. When people feel happy, their faces go up, their bodies go up. When they feel depressed, their mouth goes down, their bodies go droop. When they're angry, they go angry. You can tell, and afraid. You can tell by the expressions on people's face and what their bodies are doing, how they feel. How is that possible? The reason is that you have mirror neurons that allow you, by looking at someone else, to know what it would be like to have that happening in your body. And those mirror neurons that are firing, let's say, their muscles would be like your muscles, they're connected to your emotional system, and that allows you to tell how someone else would feel. It is the neural basis of empathy. Now, we also know from the study of neuroscience that purposes and purposeful actions are indicated down to the single neuron level. We went through this in lecture 5, going through the evidence showing that, for example, if even a monkey is grasping for something like a banana, if they succeed in achieving the purpose, certain neurons will fire. But if they just move their hand, the neurons don't fire. That is, then their other neurons will fire when they just move their hand. The importance of this is that purpose is coded neurally. Empathy is coded neurally. The strict father model seems to be a reflex of people wanting to achieve their purposes, wanting to have the authority and power over other people to achieve their purposes. The nurturant model has to do with empathy and acting upon that empathy. So these are two very different parts of what it is to be human. We have both of them, and chances are that variations on these models of one sort or another are going to occur in various parts of the world. I don't know how Chinese moral systems work, but chances are you're going to get variations on each of these in this system. Now, why is this important? It says that morality comes out of experience in the world and having a human body and brain. That morality is embodied. that says there isn't a universal morality, but there's a limited range of moral concepts, and we can describe what they are. So what you have is a very different moral system. It says there isn't one morality, there are a number of them, there are a number of different metaphors, but they're not infinite. It's not that anything goes. There are certain ranges, and moreover, you may have one particular version of morality or another, but again, it's not just anything at all. Okay, let me stop with the discussion of concepts and then tell you a few other things about what we had to do in this book. Remember where we were. We were asking, what does it take to construct a philosophy? And one thing we saw was we had to go through all the basic concepts: time, events, causation, morality, the mind, etc., and show how they are understood. And we went through all the metaphors for all of these concepts and showed all of them were metaphorical. But then we had to do something more that is required of every philosophy. Every philosophy has to use its mode of analysis to describe other philosophies, previous philosophies. And so you find, starting with Aristotle, Aristotle describes the pre-Socratics and so on, and you go up through history, philosophers always comment on the previous philosophers, using their own understanding of those philosophers. Bertrand Russell, for example, one of the creators of analytic philosophy, has a big book called The History of Western Philosophy, where he tries to explain Western philosophy in terms of analytic philosophy. Takes analytic philosophy for granted and then tries to explain it all that way. What does that mean for our attempt? It means that what we need to do is take cognitive linguistics and apply it to philosophies as a subject matter. So we started with the pre-Socratics, and we looked at the metaphors of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Then we went through Plato's metaphors, Aristotle's metaphors, Descartes' metaphors, Kant's metaphors, and finally the analytic philosophers' metaphors. Now, I can't do all of that today, but that's the second half of the book. It's a long description to go through all the metaphors of all of these philosophers. But let me tell you briefly the kind of things we found. What we found is that each philosopher has a set of metaphors taken as absolute truths. They'll have some metaphors and they just take them as truths, and then they reason on the basis of those metaphors, and all their reasoning uses just those metaphors. They never go outside those metaphors. And that's why you get a distinct type of reasoning in Plato, and a very different kind of reasoning in Aristotle, and a very different kind of reasoning in Descartes or Kant or Donald Davidson or contemporary philosophers. Okay? And so what we did was we worked out what that metaphor system was for the pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant's moral theory, and analytic philosophy. Now, I can't go through it all, but let me give you a few of the things that we found. What is a minimal difference between Plato and Aristotle? Plato had the basic metaphor. First of all, you need to know something about Western philosophy. All of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the ones before Plato, before Socrates, all of those philosophers had certain things in common. They all assumed that the world was rational, that there was a rational structure to the world. They were reacting against the view of the Greek gods. In the Greek gods, the idea was the world was made up because there were these gods up there, and they were completely crazy, irrational beings, very selfish and self-centered, and they would be fighting with one another, and what happened in your life depended upon what the gods were doing and how they happened to impinge on you. Okay, this was a rebellion against the idea of the Greek gods. It said, no, the world works in a sort of rational way. It's not just a matter of the whims of the gods. So that's part of Greek philosophy, says that. It says, moreover, that every entity in the world, let's say this one, is a member of a category. So this object is a member of the category bottle. Okay? Every entity, you are a member of the category person. That's a member of the category chair. Every entity is a member of a category. Secondly, it says that every category itself is an entity in the world, that categories are things in the world. Okay? And it says that every category is defined by an essence. What is an essence? It is a list of properties, of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a member of the category. So, for example, if you look at a tree, what is the essence of a tree? The essence of a tree is that it's made of wood, that it has a certain shape, so that's called the substantive essence, substance. It has a form essence, that is, it has a trunk, roots, branches, leaves. Okay, that's its form. So that's its formal essence. It has an essence with respect to change. It starts from a seed and it sprouts up, and then it gets bigger and it grows a bark and it grows branches, and then it starts to decline and it dies. Okay? That is its cycle of change. So the idea is every essence has either a substantive, formal, or change, dynamic aspect to it. That's what essences are. And essences do one more thing. Because something has an essence, it explains the behavior of that thing in the world. So if you ask, why is it that a tree can burn? Because it's made of wood. Why can you climb a tree? Because it has limbs, and so on. Why can forests regenerate? Because there's a pattern of growth, pattern of change. That is, the essences determine the behavior of things. Right? That is all part of pre-Socratic philosophy. Then there's one more thing. If each entity is a member of a category, and the category itself exists in the world as an entity, then that category must be the member of a bigger category. And the bigger category has to be a thing in the world, and that must be a member of a bigger category, and so on. And you keep on getting a hierarchy of categories, and then there's a further assumption. There is a highest category. A category in which everything in the world, it contains everything in the world. And there's a name for that category. It's called being. Being is the category that contains everything that exists. Okay? This comes from pre-Socratic philosophy. That's what being is. Now, if every category is defined by an essence that tells you what everything is in that category is like. Chairs have an essence, they have backs, they have seats, they're off the ground, and so on. Right? Trees have an essence, bottles have an essence, and so on. What about the category of being? Now, they reasoned as follows. If you know something's essence, and if its behavior logically follows from as a consequence of its essence, then what you should be doing is going around figuring out what the essences are. That's how you make predictions about the world. But moreover, if you can get essences about higher categories, you can make better predictions about more things. And if you could figure out the essence of the highest category, being, then you could figure out how everything behaved. So the main question of philosophy determined by the pre-Socratics was, what is the essence of being? Right? Being is given by this sequence of hierarchy of categories. It's the highest category, has everything in it. All categories are defined by an essence that determines behavior. And you ask, what is the essence of being? And then you have various pre-Socratic philosophers, making claims about the essence of being. So there was somebody who said, the essence of being is water. Everything is made up of water. Right? Someone else comes along and says, hey, wait a minute, fire is not made up of water. There are four things: earth, air, fire, and water. Fire isn't water. And moreover, these things come in opposites. Fire puts out water, and so on. So given that, the essence of being must be indeterminate matter, because it can't be any one of those, and so on. And you get one philosopher after another saying what the essence of being is. You have a philosopher coming along and saying, you can't step in the same stream twice. The essence of being is change. That is, the dynamic pattern of change. That's the real essence of being. And so on. Each pre-Socratic philosopher tries to give a different answer to the essence of being. You get another philosopher coming along saying the essence of being is number. Okay? Well, the assumption was, if the essence of being is number, what is the rational structure of the world? It's given by arithmetic, by addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. And then, when they've discovered that and therefore everything could be done by giving numbers to things and doing arithmetic on them, then it was discovered that the square root of 2 could not be given by addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. That the square root of 2 was irrational, and people committed suicide because the world ceased to be a rational place, if you believe that, and so on. So this was taken very, very seriously. What about Plato? Plato comes along and he says that essences are ideas that you have. And the ideas don't have to be things that you have, they can be ideas that are sort of floating in the universe. And he says, moreover, that essences are ideal things, the best of things, so that they're both ideas and ideals. Now, there's a part of Plato where you can, if you start reading Plato, where things get a little mysterious. Plato at some point starts to talk about the good. And he says something that sounds very mysterious indeed. He says the sentence, the good is the causal source of all that is. The good is the causal source of all that is. Now, what sense can you make of this? I remember when I was a college freshman, I read this, and I said, this doesn't make any sense at all. Nothing. But in writing this book, it began to make sense. And let me try to explain how. Plato had the idea that essences, the essence of categories of things, that essences were abstract. They were ideas. They weren't out there physically in the world. That the world was a sort of shadow of the essences. That the really real things were the ideas, the Platonic ideas. And that these were not only ideas, but they were the best examples of things. So that the Platonic idea of a bottle was also the Platonic ideal of the bottle. It was the best bottle, the best possible bottle, as well as being the essence of a bottle. That ideals and ideas came together in essences. Moreover, he then said, let us look at the hierarchy of categories. Each category has an essence. You have a higher category, a higher category, a higher category. Let's go up to the top. We have the essence of being at the top. Okay. That essence is both an idea, it's abstract, and it's an ideal, it's the best thing, it's the good. It's good, it's the best thing there is. Well, not exactly the best thing there is, because if you look at the essence of being and all the other essences, they form a category of essences. So if the essences form a category, there must be an essence of essence. Right? Follows, metaphorically. There must be an essence of essence, and it must be an idea and an ideal. And it must not only be an ideal, it must be the highest ideal. The most ideal thing there is, and we give that a name, we call it the good. When Plato talks about the good, that is what he means, the essence of essence. Now, what is the property of the essence of essence? Essences are the causal source of behavior. And if this is not only the essence of being, but the essence of all essences, it is the causal source of the behavior of essence. The good is the causal source of all that is. If you put his metaphors together, they make sense. I mean, Platonic sense, Plato's sense. All right? So when you start to read a philosopher like Plato, if you have figured out what his metaphors are, it starts to make sense. The reasoning actually follows. And what we did when we did this, we would go through his arguments, which when we first read them made no sense at all. We didn't see why from here you would reach that conclusion and the next conclusion. If you understand the metaphors, they actually do all follow from a metaphorical logic. Now, what's the difference between Plato and Aristotle? Plato says ideas are, that essences are ideas. Aristotle says that ideas are essences, exactly the reverse. He says that the ideas you have in your mind are the essences of things in the world. He says the world is made up of objects. The categories are out there in the world, and the essences of the categories are in the world. And he says your ideas, if you really can understand something, your ideas are those essences. The mind, he says, from understanding is grasping, can grasp the essences of the world and take them into your mind to form ideas. That your ideas are the essences of things in the world, and that, he says, is how you can do science. He's the first scientist. He says, you can do science by having the essences of things in the world, because from the essences you can predict behavior. Okay? And then he went out trying to do biology, physics, and so on, trying to characterize what the essences of biological categories were, and so on. Now, you see from this that when you do the metaphorical analyses of different philosophers, you can begin to understand what the enterprise of philosophy is. These are people trying to understand how the world rationally works in this way. Whoops. Okay. Now, let's skip ahead a little. I don't want to go too much into this, but I do want to talk about two things. I want to talk a little about Descartes and a little about analytic philosophy, and then stop. Descartes made a major break. Descartes asked, how do I know that I exist? And he concluded, I think, therefore I exist. I exist because I'm a thinking being. And moreover, he said, what makes me a being is that I exist, that I am rational. Okay? And he said, he said, how do I know that I'm thinking? Because I have clear and distinct ideas, and I can pick out my clear and distinct ideas. Now let's stop right there and look at the metaphor involved. It's an important central metaphor, and it goes like this. Knowing is seeing. Understanding is seeing clearly. And in order to have knowledge, you have to be able to have mental vision. That is, and notice you have things like, that's a clear argument, that's an opaque argument, and so on. Now, in this, that metaphor is elaborated very, very greatly, and it's there all over the place in Descartes. The notion of a clear and distinct idea is in the metaphor of mental vision. And let me give you some idea of how rich this is. An idea is an object that you see. Knowing an idea is seeing an object clearly. A person who knows is a person who sees. The light of reason is ordinary light. Visual focusing is mental attention. Mental intellectual acuity is visual acuity. A mental viewpoint on something is a physical viewpoint. An impediment to knowing is a visible obstruction, like pulling the wool over your eyes, or being blind, or something that keeps you from seeing. Now, it turns out that Descartes uses this all over the place. He says, I term that clear, which is present and apparent to an attentive mind. In the same way as we assert that when we see objects clearly when being present to the regarding eye, they operate on it with sufficient strength. But the distinct is that which is so precise and different from all other objects that it contains within it nothing but what is clear. That is, he is reasoning entirely in terms of the metaphor of knowing is seeing. And you find this throughout Descartes. Now, there are other metaphors as well. I won't go through them. There's a lot of stuff on Descartes' philosophy here. And there are other metaphors that he uses. Now, what about Kant's moral theory? Kant has, if you start to read Kant's moral theory, it's very turgid. It's not so obvious. But it turns out that in Kant's moral theory, there is a central metaphor. It's that reason is a strict father, in the strict father model of the family. That the mind is a family, that the strict father is reason, that the child is will, and that external evil in the world is passion. And the idea is that the reason should govern the will and overcome the passions. Right? That the evil you have to stand up to is the passions, and that what the strict father has to do in terms of teaching right and wrong, the will is what carries out actions, and the strict father must tell the will what to do, what not to do, and discipline it. Okay? And that is the central role of metaphor in Kantian morality. There are three other basic metaphors that Kant uses together with that. But what's interesting is that Kant uses strict father morality with reason as the strict father. Finally, I'd like to talk a bit about analytic philosophy. There is a set of metaphors that I discussed in one of the previous lectures for the mind. And in this section of the book on the mind, we go through the basic metaphors for mind. And I'll tell you some of them right off. There's the basic one is the mind is a body that functions in space, and ideas are the things it functions with respect to. And special cases are that thinking is moving, and that ideas are locations you move through, so you think step by step and you reach conclusions, or you can be going in circles. Another one is that knowing is seeing, so you can say it's clear, it's unclear, I see what you're saying, and so on. And another one is that thinking is manipulating objects. It's playing with ideas. Communication is sending ideas to someone else. Ideas are objects, and thinking is manipulating the objects, putting the ideas together, and so on. Those are important metaphors. Another one is that thinking is mathematical calculation. You put two and two together. You form an account of something by doing counting. You can say, let me sum it up for you, which is like adding up a sum. You have a metaphor that thought is language, which is a very basic metaphor in which we talk about the vocabulary of philosophical ideas, and so on. Thought is language is a very important metaphor. You can say things like, I can hear myself think, as if you can, the thoughts can be or expressed in words. And then there's a very important one, which is the mind is a machine which turns out thoughts in a step-by-step fashion. Okay? Now, if you put these metaphors together, what you get is a set of consequences that are basically analytic philosophy. So, for example, take the notion of analyzing, of linguistic analysis, which is the center of analytic philosophy. It says that ideas are objects, and therefore analysis is looking at the structure of those objects and breaking down their structure. Okay? So that's one of these metaphors. It says that if ideas are objects or locations in space, they're independent of the thinker. That is, if you're seeing something, the thing you see is independent of you. If you're moving to a place, the place exists independent of you. If you're playing around with and manipulating an object, the object exists independent of you. If those are ideas, it says, ideas exist independent of the thinker thinking the ideas. This is one of the central tenets of analytic philosophy, that ideas have nothing to do with the mind. They exist independent of minds. Very strange thing, but it's required if truth is the relation between symbols and things of the world, then ideas and meanings have to be independent of minds. Okay? It's a very strange thing, but that's what analytic philosophy says, among other things. In each case, in this metaphor, the idea is a thing in the world. And in analytic philosophy, the correspondence theory of truth says that a sentence of truth if the words are fit a state of affairs in the world, that if the ideas are a states of affairs in the world. So what you have here, and I could go through the rest, for example, in analytic philosophy, a branch of it, the formal philosophy, where you use logic and formal logic, what does formal logic say? It says that you have a formal language. Thought is language. The language is made up of symbols. Ideas, the symbols are objects, so the ideas, so you're manipulating the symbols, and symbol manipulation is thinking. That's what formal logic is. Moreover, it's a branch of mathematics. It's like thinking is mathematical manipulation, putting two and two together in a mechanical way. The mind is a machine. You think in a mechanical way and you put ideas together. Basically, the metaphors for mind structure analytic philosophy. Our normal metaphors for mind, when you look at them, provide the structure to what Western analytic philosophy is. And what's interesting about that is analytic philosophy says there can't be any conceptual metaphors. So that the very philosophy that says there can't be conceptual metaphors is made up of about 20 different metaphors. Okay? And that's what we do through here. Okay. So what we've done in this book is outline what philosophy is about. What we've tried to do is say, first, there are results from cognitive linguistics that don't fit any of the existing philosophies, and therefore we have to construct a new one. We have a couple of names for it. One was experientialism, the other is embodied realism. But basically it comes out of the idea that the mind is embodied. And the previous philosophies all assume that the mind is disembodied, right? Whether it's Plato has ideas that are abstract, Aristotle has them out in the world. For Descartes, there's a strict separation between mind and body. The mind is not part of the body, and so on. The idea, and the same thing in analytic philosophy. Meaning, ideas are disembodied, they're in the relationship between symbols and the world. So, when you go to an embodied theory of meaning, an embodied theory of ideas as we have, you have to have a new philosophy. And we give an example of what meaning is, what truth is, what understanding is in terms of neuroscience and mental simulation. And then we have to say, we have a method. The method is doing cognitive linguistics. And then we ask, what are the basic ideas you have to analyze? And they are time, events, causation, the mind, the self, morality, and being. And we do that. We show that they are all metaphorical. And then you have to say, what about previous philosophies? What are they like? And we make a discovery. The discovery is that every philosophy is defined by a set of metaphors that are taken as truths and not even noticed as being metaphors, and that all the reasoning is done within them. Okay? That is what this book, Philosophy in the Flesh, is about, and I'll stop there.